Hello, I'm Shane M. Nygaard, and welcome to the eighth house, From Death to the Dead, a Mythic Currents video. I've previously descended into the eighth house in my Shades of Inheritance videos in two different versions here on YouTube, which really began to further shift my understanding of the eighth house. In this video, I'm exploring one particular dynamic of this mysterious house, the shift from talking about the eighth house as death to talking about it as encounters with the dead. I don't mean grabbing a Ouija board or anything like that, but rather those that have come before. Let's explore. So often today, the eighth house is commonly introduced as the house of death. That association is not wrong, but it can become so familiar that we stop imagining what it actually means. Death is an event. A life ends, a body stops breathing, something crosses out of visibility. But the dead are not an event. The dead are a presence, a relationship, and sometimes a demand. They remain through books, paintings, music, myths, inheritances, unfinished vows, cultural wounds, erotic memory, and works of imagination. They enter rooms through voices that are no longer breathing, yet nevertheless continue to breathe through us. This presentation explores the eighth house as the chamber where such encounters occur, where the past becomes active, where the living receive what did not begin with them, and where contact with the dead changes both the inheritance and the inheritor. Astrology often approaches a house through a cluster of key words. The eighth house receives one of the most dramatic collections of these words: sex, death, inheritance, other people's money, crisis, taboo, secrecy, and transformation. These words provide useful handles, but the handle must not be mistaken for the entire door, or the door for the world beyond it. To say that the eighth house concerns sex and death is like saying the ocean concerns water. True, certainly, but it tells us nothing yet about undertow, shipwreck, baptisms, pearls, monsters, drowning, memory, or song. The challenge is therefore not to discard the traditional meanings, but to enter them more deeply. What does death leave behind? What does sex expose? What does inheritance place inside us? And what hidden bonds cross the apparent boundary of an individual life? The eighth house begins where the key word opens and the descent starts. Astrologically, it is important that we do not place every encounter with the dead automatically into the eighth house. The houses describe different kinds of relationship. So here we see the fourth house brings us close to the dead of origin, those connected with family, ancestry, homeland, and the foundations beneath our personal story. The 12th house evokes a more diffuse presence, the forgotten, the unnamed, or collective dead who move through dreams, history, and psychic atmosphere. The eighth house, however, is more charged and particular. These are the dead with whom something remains active. Their work still grips us. Their story still asks for an answer. Their unfinished presence enters our imagination and alters the course of our lives. The distinction is not rigid, but it helps us to see what makes the eighth house unique. Here, the dead are not simply behind us or around us, they are in relationship with us. And the eighth house complicates the idea that a life belongs entirely to the person living it. We are always receiving something through others, through intimacy, inheritance, artistic influence, loss, and the histories into which we enter. Some of what teaches us is visible and easily named. Much of it arrives more quietly as a way of seeing, a responsibility, an unfinished story, or a voice that begins to matter before we necessarily understand why. This is why the eighth house asks such a powerful question. What is moving through me that did not begin with me? The question does not assume that everything inherited must be preserved. What reaches us may need to be accepted, examined, transformed, or released. But first, we must recognize that it has entered the room. The eighth house begins with that recognition. My life contains more than what I consciously chose. So here at the distinction at the center of this presentation is simple but profound. Death is an event. The dead are a relationship. Death names the crossing. The dead name what remains capable of acting after that crossing has occurred. A person may become a state, memory, photograph, or even silence. A person may be known from artwork, a voice, or unfinished obligation. A civilization may preserve its dead through museums, theaters, libraries, recordings, archives, translations. I mean, think about all the options. There's like revivals and biographies and adaptations. It really shows us the dead are therefore not gone in any simple way. They hang on walls, sing through speakers, occupy sentences, and stand invisibly behind inherited forms. The eighth house is not merely the moment when life ends, it is the charged continuance that follows. The uncanny reality that something has left the visible world while retaining enough potency to rearrange the lives of those who remain. Now we can look at some examples here of what I'm talking about with this notion of the shift from death to the dead. And here we have Terrence McNally's Masterclass, which offers one of the clearest modern images of the eighth house. Opera legend Maria Callas teaches young singers, but she is not merely offering vocal instruction. She appears herself almost as a living shade. She's surrounded by her lost voice, former triumphs and sacrifices. She recalls humiliations and lovers and audiences and roles she's played and countless memories. The students arrive to the master class hoping to learn to sing more beautifully. Callas demands something more dangerous, that they know what and whom they are carrying. Opera did not begin with them. It didn't begin with Callas. Every phrase contains earlier singers, composers, characters, theaters, bodies, and centuries of disciplined transmission. I mean, it's so profound. In Callas's presence, artistic inheritance becomes an encounter with the dead. The student must descend into and encounter the lineage before she sings, the earlier voices, the originating roles, the traditions, disciplines, and even the sacrifices embedded in the music. Only then does she open her mouth. And when she does, Callas wants to hear more than the young singer alone. We should also hear the depth of the form, the history within the music, and the dead whose artistry still lives inside it. It is an extraordinary eighth house exchange. The stage becomes an underworld chamber where the living singer meets what and who came before and prepares to give that inheritance sound again. See, looking a little further at this, Callas makes this inheritance starting startlingly precise. She does not speak vaguely about honoring tradition. She names the line Sophie, the young singer, is being asked to enter. Behind the aria stand earlier singers, earlier interpretations, and ultimately Giuditta Pasta, the 19th century soprano who originated the role. Callas asks Sophie to establish a living line from the present singer, Sophie, through Callas, through Milanoff, Poncel, and Lehmann, toward the originating presence within the music, pasta. I mean, it's not like a museum display or anything. Sophie is not being asked to reproduce the dead or impersonate their styles. She's being asked to enter the line deeply enough that when she sings, its history becomes audible through her own living voice. I mean, this is an extraordinary image of the eighth house inheritance. The dead require the living because only a living body can sound the note again. Yet the living also require the dead because without lineage, the performance risks becoming so shallow and like cut off and just almost like just personal. And the eighth house becomes a chamber of exchange. The dead receive new embodiment, while the living receive depth, authority, gravitas, and transformation through what they have learned to carry. Do you get the exceptional eighth house experience here? I just think it's incredible. But we can look at a couple more examples here too from different genres of artistry. So another example beyond Maria Callas in Masterclass is Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles. Here, Miller demonstrates the eighth house as an encounter with mythic and literary dead. Achilles and Patroclus from Homer's The Iliad are not the author's familial ancestors. Those would be fourth house connections. They belong to an underworld lineage of war, eros, glory, grief, violence, and loss. Miller descends into the charged remains of their ancient story and brings them back through her own language and her own imagination. She does not leave them sealed behind the distance of Homeric antiquity. She makes them intimate, desiring, vulnerable, and once again capable of altering the living reader. So much transformation here. And this is more than preservation or adaptation. The inherited story becomes a relational chamber in which the contemporary writer, Miller, the remembered dead, and the modern audience are all connected and are all changed. The past receives another voice. The present receives an ancient grief. The eighth house appears as the place where myth is not merely remembered, but permitted to become emotionally alive again. It's just incredible. And have y'all seen Ratatouille? In the amazing film Ratatouille, the deceased chef Auguste Gusteau remains creatively active as Remy's imaginal guide. Remy enters the world Gusteau left behind, so he inherits his culinary vision and gives that vision an unexpected new body through his own pause and perception. The inheritance is larger than a restaurant name or reputation. It is unfinished vocation transmitted by the dead. Remy is also an underworld creature, which is fascinating. He moves through sewers, ceilings, walls. He gets into the storerooms and goes through all the hidden passageways, the concealed anatomy beneath the polished restaurant. He inhabits the realm civilization associates with waste, contamination, decay, and vermin. Very much an underworld there. Yet from that rejected place, he creates nourishment. Oh, I love it. His final dish resurrects Anton Ego's childhood memory so completely that the buried past becomes present feeling. Remy communes with a dead master, works beneath the visible world, and prepares food capable of raising memory from below. A delightful emissary of the eighth house. And we have one more here. And from the Lord of the Rings, the return of the king, Aragorn's journey through the paths of the dead presents the eighth house in its most literal mythic grandeur. The dead he summons are not merely deceased individuals. They are oath-bound shades whose broken pledge has outlived their bodies. Death did not conclude the matter because the contract remained active. Aragorn descends into the mountain, confronts what is cursed and unfinished, and speaks with an authority rooted in inheritance. The ghosts become an underworld resource, but the relationship is reciprocal. Aragorn does not simply exploit their power. By calling the ancient debt due, he permits them to complete the vow and finally be released. The living world is changed through their participation, and the dead are changed through contact with the living air. This is a majestic image of eighth house transformation. It just gives me the chills whenever I watch that scene in the movie. Inheritance answered, hidden power activated, and unresolved past completed, and both sides of the boundary altered by the exchange. Again, it's just incredible. And the dead are not always asking to be healed, corrected, or nostalgically preserved. Sometimes they ask to be received. Sometimes they ask the living to give form to what they could not finish, to recognize what they embodied, to testify to what occurred, or to carry their beauty or terror differently. An artist may revoice a neglected tradition. A descendant may interrupt an inherited wound. A researcher may restore a forgotten name. A performer may allow an old role to breathe through a new body. A living heir may complete an oath whose force had not expired. This is why eighth house transformation is not simply self-improvement. The living person changes, but the inheritance may also change through being consciously received and reworked. The eighth house is an exchange chamber. Something enters us from the dead, something returns through us, altered. The relationship can become transmission, completion, testimony, liberation, or even renewed life. And restoring the eighth house requires more than replacing one set of keywords with another. It requires restoring the house's imaginal grandeur. The eighth house is where death becomes transmission. Intimacy exposes power. The body remembers. Oaths remain active. Voices return, and the past reveals that it was never entirely past. Art is one of civilization's great eighth house technologies. Through it, Sappho still sings. Shakespeare stages ambition and ruin. Callas makes grief resound. Baldwin refuses to let the soul look away. And Van Gogh's sunflowers continue their golden burning. The dead become transmissible, and the living do not remain unchanged. Sometimes the encounter begins dramatically through loss, inheritance, or crisis. Sometimes it begins quietly. A record turns, a painting looks back, or a book falls open like a portal. The old words start breathing. The dead enter the room, and the eighth house opens the floor. How might we recognize this in an actual chart? Natal eighth house placements may describe an enduring orientation toward what others avoid or fail to notice, hidden histories, artistic lineages, psychological complexity, erotic power, inherited resources, grief, secrets, debts, unfinished stories. There's more, but those are just some examples. This does not mean a life of constant crisis. It may indicate a capacity to remain present when life requires depth, danger, ambiguity, or consequence. During an eighth house transit, that underworld chamber may temporarily open. We may receive an inheritance, discover a forgotten artist, enter a consuming relationship, confront financial entanglement, encounter grief, research a buried history, or realize that an old voice is asking to move through our work. The practical question is not simply what will happen? It is what has entered my life? What does it ask of me? What might be transformed through my response? That's the eighth house, for transitioning from death to the dead. So thank you for watching. May what came before you find new life through you. May what you carry be carried consciously. And may every descent Return with something worth bringing back. For additional mythopoetic astrological content in essay form, visit my Substack, Mythic Currents, at mythiccurrents.substack.com.